faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, we're interpreting a book called The Logic of Collective Action. It primarily discusses the production and distribution of public goods. Public goods include public services like national defense, education, healthcare, elderly care, as well as public policies such as taxation, land planning, market access, qualifications, and industry regulations. These things are closely tied to every modern person's daily life, but they aren't supplied by the market like ordinary goods. Public goods are generally provided by the government to the whole society, and the government also decides how to distribute them. To compete for public goods, businesses and the public form various groups to pressure the government through lobbying, public relations, propaganda, and other means. These groups are called interest groups. For example, interest groups like retired teachers, foundations, and retired civil servant funds demand the government to increase pensions. For example, groups like automobile manufacturing associations and steel manufacturing associations demand the government to raise tariffs to protect the domestic market. Since the 1950s, Western economics began focusing on the distribution of public goods, forming public choice theory. Initially, mainstream academia believed democratic representation provided a fair stage for interest groups, where each group could voice opinions, pressure officials, and fight for their interests. And then, in this open competition, groups representing majority interests would inevitably overwhelm minority interest groups, leading to fair, just, and reasonable public goods production and distribution. However, Olson proves in this book that the logical foundation of that idea is flawed. When competing for public goods, the majority doesn't necessarily overwhelm the minority. Large groups often lose to small groups due to poor coordination, so public goods distribution doesn't automatically become fair. Instead, it keeps favoring the few. Traditional interest group theory doesn't align with reality. Beyond that, Olson further analyzes how large groups organize and operate, offering new theoretical guidance to enhance their effectiveness. Thus, this book became a foundational work in public choice. To honor Olson's discovery, the American Political Science Association established an award in his name, and The Logic of Collective Action won the Most Enduring Contribution Book Award from the American Management Association in 1993. Also, in 1995, it also received the Leon Epstein Award from the American Political Science Association. Now we'll interpret the essence of this book for you from three perspectives. First, why are large groups less capable of action than small groups? Second, what should successful large groups do? Third, what's the practical value of Olson's discovery? First, let's discuss part one. Before this book was published, people took for granted that those with common interests would naturally form interest groups to take collective action for shared benefits, right? Olson is neighbors in a building would collectively fund hallway lighting. Shareholders of the same company would unite to maintain stock prices, and the global proletariat would join forces to improve their political and economic status. Well, I wanted to take my pride. But reality isn't like that. Through observing American interest groups, Olson proposed that a social group's organizational level is inversely proportional to its size. In other words, while large groups share common interests, they struggle to organize into interest groups. It's actually easier with fewer people. In the US, entrepreneurs are the most organized group. They organize chambers of commerce and associations by subsector. The Encyclopedia of American Associations lists directories for trade, manufacturing, and service chambers. Their section is 10 times longer than other social organizations, with nearly 100% of business owners joining some chamber. In contrast, less than 5% of African Americans join the NAACP. 6% of drivers are AAA members. About 15% of veterans join organizations like the American Legion, while National Consumers League members make up just one in 160,000 consumers. American entrepreneurs' high organization stems from limited surviving firms in each subsector after prolonged competition. For example, the National Directory of Associations shows under 50 firms per metallurgy subsector. In timber, furniture, and paper industries, subsectors typically have 10 to 20 firms. Conversely, massive interest groups like millions of veterans, tens of millions of drivers, or billions of consumers struggle to organize. They either can't organize at all or are loosely organized and lack the ability to act. For example, consumers far outnumber businesses, but organized activities to boycott unethical business practices are rare. Or take peace advocates. They're the vast majority in the US, but their influence on Congress pales compared to a few military industrial giants. That's why America's military budget keeps growing. Even the same people, when forming large groups, are far less capable than in small groups, like American entrepreneurs. When they form small trade associations, they're highly effective. And surveys show 825 out of Washington's 1,247 most active lobbying groups are industry funded. These associations have countless wins in subsidies, tax cuts, antitrust probes, and regulations through lobbying. A prime example is blocking universal health care.
Whenever a left-leaning president pushes for universal health care, insurance and pharmaceutical lobbies mobilize public opinion, equating it with planned economies and dictatorships to derail it. Oh.
To this day, the U.S. remains one of few developed nations without universal health care. Another clear case. A small group of 20 or more financial giants leverage their sway over Congress and the Fed to push monetary expansion to extremes, ballooning U.S. debt. But when entrepreneurs form large groups like the National Association of Manufacturers, or U.S. Chamber, they become ineffective, failing to stop wage hikes, progressive taxes, or anti-tax avoidance rules. So why is it hard to organize large groups effectively? Why are large groups less capable than small ones? Olson introduced the rational man concept to analyze interest groups' organization and actions. This rational man is a core assumption in Western economics. Simply put, it assumes people prefer leisure, always wanting rewards without effort or cost. To motivate this rational person, you must offer incentives. When someone named Lee acts as an individual, it's like a temple with one monk meeting water. He must fetch it himself, with no one to share the burden. When he's in a small group, it's like two monks sharing a shoulder pole. Each carries an end with no way to shirk responsibility. But when there are very few members, small groups work because everyone knows each other and can see who contributes what. Everything's transparent, and when public goods are secured, each member gets a large share, boosting motivation to act. For example, when the federal government's hundreds of billions in arms contracts go to just 5 or 6 firms, they'll do anything. But in large groups, members don't know each other, making it hard to monitor who contributes. Like a third monk arriving who avoids duties. Without someone creating a duty roster, everyone waits for public goods to magically appear. Western scholars call this free riding behavior. It's common in public goods distribution since gains are equally shared. In large groups, individual shares become tiny. Effort outweighs gain, so people free ride. This is why big groups struggle to organize and act. All right, that concludes part 1. Next, part 2. What should large groups do to succeed? We'll examine this through organization and operation. First, organization. Olson says large groups need dual incentives: rewards to attract members and penalties to force loyalty. Successful U.S. groups like blue-collar unions use this, offering benefits as positive incentives. They learned this from railroad unions' historic success. In early U.S. rail transport, frequent accidents and worker deaths led commercial insurers to deny coverage to railroad workers. Railroad unions stepped in, offering insurance to members, which fueled their growth. National unions adopted this approach, providing extra benefits beyond job security and wages. For example, offering unemployment aid, medical relief, retirement benefits, and customized insurance for workers across industries. For negative incentives, national unions had two trump cards: the right to establish picket lines. In the 1920s, federal law allowed unions to set picket lines and use force during strikes to block anyone crossing them. This prevented workers from entering factories, ensuring strike effectiveness and greatly enhancing unions' bargaining power with management. In 7 years after the law passed, U.S. strike participation grew tenfold. The other trump card: employers were barred from hiring non-union workers. Through sustained pressure on Congress, national unions secured crucial legislation. This was the Wagner Act, passed in 1935. The act made it illegal for employers to hire non-union members. This meant workers had to join unions to get jobs. Federally backed enforcement gave unions immense appeal. The year the Wagner Act passed, U.S. union membership grew by 50%. Large groups like the AMA and Bar Association also used dual incentives for white-collar workers. First, negative incentives. Respecting expertise. U.S. governments delegate authority to associations to manage sectors like healthcare and law. For example, licensing exams, credentialing, malpractice arbitration, and forensic evaluations. These critical jurisdictional powers rest with industry associations. Undoubtedly, any practitioner who dares to operate independently without joining professional associations will face endless career troubles. And for positive incentives, these associations provide various benefits while fighting for public goods for lawyers and doctors. For example, the AMA offers members internships at major hospitals and invites doctors to regular academic exchanges. So far, we've discussed successful cases of large group organization. Now let's examine negative examples. Olson viewed contemporary U.S. political parties as classic examples of ineffective large groups. The root cause is their lack of proper incentive mechanisms. On one hand, election victories yield few government positions, rarely reaching ordinary members. On the other, federal law prevents parties from interfering with voting or penalizing defectors, leaving them powerless over members. And thus, loyalty remains low among both Republican and Democratic members. Outside election seasons, parties barely exist. At times, Democrats didn't even maintain a national headquarters, and voters often switch parties between elections. So, a candidate's specific platform proves far more important than party affiliation in attracting votes. Olson noted that America's top 500 lobbying groups are small interest groups, representing fewer people than major parties, yet they form stronger organizations with effective incentives. Similarly, groups like church charities, consumers, and peace advocates resemble parties, unable to offer benefits or enforce membership. Olson termed these unorganized groups with poor incentives latent groups, unable to pressure public goods distribution. In modern society, they become the disadvantaged.
Earlier, we discussed how successful large groups should organize.
Now let's discuss their operations. Olson found large groups often emulate small ones by delegating tasks to compact committees to boost effectiveness. Olson uses the example of the U.S. Congress to illustrate this point. When the U.S. Congress reviews major bills, all 100 Senate members and over 500 House members attend full votes, but for specific tasks like investigating cases or amending laws, both chambers delegate work to small groups. The average committee size in the Senate is 5.4 members, and in the House, it's 7.8 members. And for state governments, task forces average 4.7 members. For city governments, they average 5.3 members. This way, a few individuals lead bill drafting, avoiding large teams shirking responsibility, thus improving legislative efficiency. All right, that concludes part 2. Next, in part 3, we'll discuss the practical value of Olson's new theory. Before Olson, mainstream American political economics saw interest group competition over public goods as a key supplement to democratic representation. In their view, using interest group competition to allocate public goods had three major advantages. First, ordinary people organizing interest groups prompts governments to reduce burdens through taxes, subsidies, and social security, easing social conflicts. Second, spontaneously formed interest groups allocating public goods through open competition are more efficient and fair than concentrating power in a few hands. Third, interest group competition aligns with the democratic principle of majority rule. Majority common interests usually overcome minority special interests in open competition, with repeated interactions leading to rational public goods distribution. Olson's new theory shattered these unrealistic notions, revealing flaws in America's public goods distribution. Due to action capability differences, small groups are super effective, large ones weak. Small minority interest groups often gain more in public goods competitions. Not everyone can organize. Many with common interests become latent groups, silent majority, lacking organizational incentives. Thus, interest group competition doesn't promote fair distribution. Conversely, entrenched interest group power causes problems, like national blue-collar unions securing excessive public goods through forced membership and extra benefits, inflating U.S. wages, and driving manufacturing overseas. Similarly, vote-dependent politicians avoid angering interest groups, cutting taxes but not raising them, resorting to massive debt to cover deficits. America's deep-seated issues stem from inherent flaws in interest group formation mechanisms. Olson's critique of America's public choice system remains relevant today. Readers interested in public choice theory should explore Olson's other work, The Rise and Decline of Nations. There, Olson argues entrenched interest groups cause national stagnation and decline. He posits more interest groups mean fewer people represented per group. These atomized groups, like individuals in large groups, refuse sacrifices for collective welfare. They divert resources to lobbying and rent-seeking instead of production, becoming societal parasites. Olson's logic of collective action exposes democratic flaws, while offering new frameworks for public goods distribution. After Olson's theory emerged, some pragmatically organized small groups to efficiently secure public goods. In 1975, others, driven by reform ideals, helped latent groups like the disadvantaged gain voice. Figures like Wu Jinglian. Chinese economists used Olson's theory to warn against vested interests blocking reforms. That concludes our interpretation. Find show notes below the audio. See you next time.